Did you see how Antonelli stepped aside to let Norris pass in Qatar? What if I told you that mistake could be the key to a scandal even bigger than the Horner-Marco war? We are going to dismantle all this controversy and what is really behind this movement that the FIA is already investigating. The situation in Qatar was tense, not only because of the scorching desert climate or the extreme tire wear, but because it was the final stretch of a strategic race on a track where overtaking is possible, but requires perfection. And there they were, Kimi Antonelli and Lando Norris, in a battle that would define more than positions, it would define perceptions. Antonelli, the Italian prodigy of Mercedes just in his debut season, was in 4th position, resisting with pinpoint consistency the attacks of one of the fittest men of the season. Lando Norris, McLaren star driver, one of the most balanced and fastest cars on the grid. Norris had fresher tires. In theory, that should be enough to execute a clean overtake. But lap after lap, the young Antonelli annulled that advantage with surgical driving. From the wall, Toto Wolff and the Mercedes engineers watched the telemetry screen with the same attention as if they were checking a time bomb. The Italian's rhythm was constant, without ups and downs. Each set showed surprising stability for a rookie. Norris couldn't get close enough to activate DRS, even with the improved traction of his MCL39. Antonelli's defense was neither aggressive nor dirty. It was clinical, calculated, and in the eyes of many, admirable. But then came lap 56, the penultimate of the Grand Prix. A moment, a couple of meters, a mistake, and everything changed. At the exit of turn 9, Antonelli applied the accelerator too early. The front axle lost grip, and although the Italian corrected quickly, he had to lift his foot. That fraction of a second took him off the ideal line, compromising his approach to turn 10, one of the most critical in the middle sector of the circuit. And there, when he needed a perfect line to defend his position, the second mistake came. A sudden snap of oversteer forced him to take his foot off the accelerator completely and correct aggressively. The car became unstable, lost traction, and went off track. That was the moment when Norris, who had been pressing tirelessly, smelled blood. He took advantage of Antonelli's loss of pace, positioned himself on the inside, and made a clean overtake that catapulted him to 4th place. But beyond the movement, what was sown was the doubt. Was it a human error by Antonelli, or was it a let-go hidden under the mask of a technical failure? What most viewers didn't see in real time was what the telemetry data later showed. Comparing lap 55 to 56, the drop in corner speed and throttle reduction were drastic. While on the previous lap Antonelli maintained partial acceleration and stable cornering, on the error lap, the Italian lifted abruptly and had to stabilize the car from the outside the racing line. The speed difference at the exit of turn 10 was more than 18 km per hour compared to his best defensive lap. A margin impossible to hide in Formula 1. And this is important. We are not talking about a feint, a covert maneuver with team code. We are talking about a visible slip in the figures. But when it happens in a context where one of the drivers involved is young, inexperienced, and the other is fighting for the championship, the media narrative does not wait. Judge. This maneuver was the turning point. Not only in the race but in the way the paddock and fans began to look at Antonelli. What seemed like a genuine mistake became, within minutes, an object of suspicion. But the most disturbing thing was not the error. It was the question that began to form in the team hallways. What if it wasn't a mistake? What if Mercedes implicitly facilitated this overtaking to weaken Red Bull in the fight for the title? Lap 56 wasn't just a number on the timetable. It was the beginning of an earthquake that the FIA would soon investigate. Because in this sport, where milliseconds decide races, a poorly taken corner can be the clue to something much bigger. The race was not yet over when the tension was already beginning to mutate into something more dangerous: suspicion. Norris's overtaking of Antonelli had been clean, almost surgical. But in the eyes of those watching with lenses sharper than broadcast cameras, it had been too clean. And in Formula 1, what seems easy almost never is. From the Red Bull wall, the reaction was immediate. Gianpiero Lambiase, Max Verstappen's race engineer, said it without any filter. "I'm not sure what happened to Antonelli, Max. It seems like he just stepped aside and let Norris pass." That phrase, broadcast live on the international signal, did not need more context. It was enough to detonate chaos. It was a message directed at Verstappen, but with a much larger audience. When Lambiase speaks, he knows exactly who is listening. Millions of fans, journalists, analysts, and even rivals. The hint was made. And the most worrying thing was not that he said it, but that the radios of the pilot involved were not transmitted. Formula One management, in a more than questionable editorial decision, omitted to broadcast the communications between Antonelli and his engineer right at the time of the incident. The narrative then was left entirely in the hands of Red Bull. What followed was a controlled explosion. In the mixed zone, even with the cars in park firm, the cameras were already looking for Helmut Marko. And as so often, the Austrian did not disappoint in his forcefulness. It was too obvious. Antonelli motioned for Lando to pass. A direct accusation without evidence, without nuances. For Marko, the overtaking had not been the product of a rookie's mistake, but rather a maneuver agreed between Mercedes and McLaren. And what made it more lethal was that thousands of spectators were already convinced of the same thing. Why was it believed so quickly? Because Red Bull knew how to capitalize on an information vacuum. Without immediate public defense of Mercedes, no technical data available to refute the accusation, no detailed onboard in the broadcast, only the perception remained. Antonelli opened the corner. Norris passed him effortlessly. And Red Bull took advantage of it with an impeccable communication strategy. And then the real fuel of the scandal appeared: social networks. Within minutes, Antonelli was the target of a massive smear campaign. There was talk of manipulation, of covert orders, even of sports fixing. The young Italian, who minutes before was praised for his masterful defense, was now accused of being Mercedes' puppet. Networks do not look for nuances. They look for culprits. The phrase "turned away" was more than an observation. It was a message of war. The FIA, pressured by media noise, announced in less than 24 hours that it would open an investigation. They called it a standard procedure review, but everyone knew it wasn't standard. It was a direct consequence of the message that Red Bull sent. Because in modern F1, what is said on the radio does not stay on the radio. It becomes speech. In headlines. In strategy, this was the real roar. Not from an engine, but of a team that, feeling cornered, reminded the world how a war is fought in Formula One. Not only with speed, but with narrative control. With noise. And with carefully planted suspicion. When a media storm hits Formula One hard, the team's reaction usually follows a clear pattern. First, silence. Then the evaluation. And finally, the counteroffensive. Mercedes, faced with the gale unleashed by Red Bull's statements, did not improvise. He reacted with the coldness of someone who knows that he is in the middle of a war in which not only is competition on the track, but in the public narrative. The Brackley team quickly understood that it was not enough to ignore the accusations. The attack was not only against Antonelli. It was against the sporting integrity of Mercedes, against its relationship with McLaren, and, above all, against the future of a driver who was just beginning to write his story in the premier class. Every second of silence was interpreted as a tacit admission of guilt. That's why, when they responded, they did it with everything. The first thing that Mercedes put on the table was the technical data. They published excerpts from Antonelli's telemetry, focusing on laps 55 and 56, where the incident occurred. They clearly showed the inconsistencies that evidenced human error. The graphs revealed an abrupt drop in traction in turn 10, a more aggressive steering correction than in the rest of the race, and a complete lift of the throttle that did not coincide with any strategic defense pattern. On a technical level, it was impossible to sustain the idea of a deliberate maneuver. In addition to telemetry, Mercedes facilitated Antonelli's seamless onboarding. In it you could observe not only the behavior of the car, but the emotional reaction of the driver after the error. A sigh, a gesture of frustration with his hand, and an immediate communication with his engineer acknowledging the failure. The tone was neither cold nor calculating. It was that of a young man disappointed with himself, aware that he had missed one of the best performances of his short career. Mercedes did not limit itself to data. They knew they were dealing with a narrative, not a technical analysis. That is why the team released an official statement in which they defended Antonelli not only as a driver, but as a person. They talked about his ethics, his commitment, his history of honesty in lower categories. It was a clear strategic move. Humanize the pilot to prevent the scandal from turning him into a symbol of corruption or manipulation. FIA technicians reviewed telemetry, radio communications, GPS data and performance comparisons with drivers circulating in similar conditions. The report was categorical. There was no indication of intentionality. All elements pointed to a driving error, caused by thermal degradation of the front tires and possibly a slight loss of pressure in the right front brake, which would explain the abrupt oversteer in turn 10. And at the center of everything he was still, Antonelli. A driver who is barely 18 years old, exposed to the brutal scrutiny of a sport that demands perfection from day one. Mercedes not only defended him, He doubled down on him. Toto Wolff, in a later interview, was direct. Andrea doesn't need us to protect him. He needs us to let him grow. This is not a scandal. It's part of the path of a real driver. Because if Norris overtaking was accidental, if Antonelli's loss of traction was a simple mistake, why did the scandal take on so much force? Why did Red Bull, so experienced, choose to make it a public crisis? And why did Mercedes and McLaren, historical rivals, maintain an almost synchronized silence at the beginning of the scandal? When Antonelli lifted his foot at turn 10, he lost a position. But perhaps he unknowingly set off a domino of consequences that no engineer can measure. Because in this championship, what is at stake is not just a trophy. It is the control of the narrative. And in that war, all teams play, even when they say they are not playing. Now that you know every technical, political, and narrative detail behind Antonelli's maneuver in Qatar, it is your turn to answer. Was it really a simple piloting error? Or did we witness a covert move that no one dares to openly acknowledge? Let me know in the comments what you think about all this.